Hello, distinguished viewers. My name's John McGee, and I'd like to welcome you to my presentation for my Capstone Project concept, a 2D top-down perspective action horror game called Shadows of the Deep, that's inspired by the cosmic horror fiction works of pulp writer H.P. Lovecraft. In Shadows of the Deep, the player assumes the role of a traveling scholar who finds himself stuck overnight in the backwater New England hamlet of Innsmouth. After discovering that the townsfolk are actually degenerate amphibian-human hybrids who worship a horrible sea deity and practice human sacrifice, the player must traverse different areas of the city, evading and occasionally using their surroundings to dispatch their abhorrent pursuers. The player must make their way through each chapter and find exit points to the next, affecting their ultimate escape from the accursed town, all while keeping from being killed or driven mad from too much exposure to the townsfolk and their scaly progenitors. During the game, the player will be able to maneuver the character vertically and horizontally across the chapter screens, and will utilize a context-sensitive input to do things like leap floor gaps, climb ladders, activate environmental hazards to dispatch the townsfolk and their allies, and occasionally interact with non-enemy NPCs. In addition to having a player health score, which decreases when enemies attack the player with physical strikes or projectile attacks, the player will have a resolve meter, which is decreased when the player is physically too close to the townsfolk and the monsters they consort with. The resolve meter will refill when the player dispatches townsfolk or deep ones with the use of context-sensitive environmental hazards, as well as refilling between chapters based on the number of enemies evaded or dispatched. In order to succeed in Shadows of the Deep, the player must study enemy movement patterns and attempts to evade enemies while searching for environmental hazards to dispatch them, all while searching for the chapter's exit point. While adjacent to or within a certain range of an environmental hazard, an exclamation point icon will appear near the character's head, indicating they can utilize the hazard with their action input, and a transparent neon overlay will indicate the area of the game screen and whatever enemies inhabit the area that the environmental hazard will affect. Shadows of the Deep draws an immense amount of inspiration from the works of Howard Phillips Lovecraft, as I'd mentioned previously. Specifically, his now public domain story The Shadows over Innsmouth informs most of the game's atmosphere, level design, and storyline to the point where even the number of levels mirrors the number of chapters in The Shadow over Innsmouth. While there will be some deviations from the pulp writer's original tale, the ultimate aims to stay as true as possible to the source material, while maintaining a narrative that will excite 21st century audiences. Games similar to Shadows of the Deep include Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, a role-playing game with a unique two-dimensional, top-down game world presentation that inspired some of the world's design ideas for Shadows of the Deep. Call of Cthulhu: Dark Corners of the Earth features a sanity loss system similar to the Resolve mechanic, but otherwise deviates much more heavily from Lovecraft's source materials. And Innsmouth no Takata, a virtual boy shooter game that retains some elements of the Lovecraft mythos as well as the setting of the story, but otherwise deviates heavily from the source materials and causes tremendous eye strain. While the literary source material in Shadows of the Deep draws from the public domain and is freely usable, some of the risks involved in creating the game include creating and animating sprites to represent the player, non-player characters, and enemies, implementing enemy movement patterns, creating a storyline that's compelling and makes players want to continue playing the game, spreading out the antagonists in the game to keep players from being overwhelmed, ensuring there are adequate environmental hazard items for the player to dispatch enemies while still retaining tension and the relative helplessness engendered by the survival horror genre, and creating level layouts that are visually compelling but still simple enough for players to navigate without too much complication. I hope you've enjoyed my presentation for Shadows of the Deep. The following is a reference page for the artwork and music I've used in this presentation.